Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Zach Draves, and welcome to our second episode of Game Recognized Game, a podcast that explores the historical relationship between basketball and hip-hop in the year that marks the official 50th anniversary of hip-hop. My co-host Mello Williams wasn't able to make it due to a scheduling conflict, but he does send his regards. In the 1980s, just around the time that hip-hop was seeping its way into the mainstream of American culture, there was a similar cultural revolution that was taking place in the world of college basketball. At the time, college basketball was growing in more ways than one and more than any other sport. With the rise of cable networks such as ESPN, conference juggernauts like the Big East, and the hype surrounding the NCAA tournament and the Final Four, college basketball became a must-see event. It was during this period and into the 1990s where a select few teams garnered much of the attention, in large part due to their playground and flashy style that mirrored the production and sensibilities of hip-hop. The John Thompson-led Georgetown Hoyas, the UNLV Runnin Rebels, the Michigan Fab Five, the Georgia Tech Lethal Weapon 3, and the LSU Tigers featuring Shaquille O'Neal replicated the culture on the court and received love off of it from many in hip-hop. In the process, they changed the game. And to this day, many in the hip-hop community hold these teams in such high regard. Tonight, we will explain the legacies of these teams and how they help solidify hip-hop's place in college basketball. And we couldn't have asked for a more epic panel tonight. Joining us tonight are Dr. Lewis Moore, professor of history at Grand Valley State University and the author of 2 books, I Fight for a Living, Boxing, and the Battle for Black Manhood. And We Will Win the Day, the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Athlete, and the Quest for Equality. In addition, he has 2 audible lectures, African American Athletes Who Made History, and a Pastime of Their Own, the Story of Negro League Baseball. He's also the co-host of the Black Athlete podcast, and he is currently working on a book about the Black quarterback. And then we also have Ben Osborne, who is a longtime writer and editor who is currently the editor-in-chief at 1:37 p.m. Previously, he produced for the Point Forward podcast, served as head of contact for Just Women's Sports, a features editor at Fox Sports, and the editor-in-chief at Bleacher Report. And perhaps more germane to this appearance, he served as the editor-in-chief of Slam Magazine. And lastly, we have J.A. Adande, who is the director of sports journalism at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, Media, and Integrated Marketing Communication. He has worked in sports media for over 3 decades, including multiple roles at ESPN, 10 years as a sports columnist at the Los Angeles Times, in addition to jobs at the Washington Post and the Chicago Sun-Times. And he continues to appear on ESPN's Around the Horn, where he has been a panelist since the show began in 2002. And oh my God, guys, I just can't believe that I got all 3 of you here tonight to talk about basketball and hip hop. And I know that was a long introduction, but I had to give all of you your props. How you guys doing tonight? And thanks for joining us.
Great. Ready to go.
Doing well.
Ready to go. Let's go. All right. Well, we'll get right into it. And what we like to do to sort of set the tone for the show is sort of go back to our roots. In other words, talk about how we first fell in love with hip hop. So, Dr. Morris, since you were the first to introduce, I'll pose the question to you. When did you first fall in love with hip hop?
So I might be the youngest one here. I'm in my mid 40s. So sometime in the mid 80s, just listening, watching BET, listening to some Big Daddy Kane, and I got to admit it now, some Too Short stuff I wasn't supposed to listen to. And that was it, man. That was my entry to hip hop, and I still listen to all the old stuff, not so much the new stuff, unless my kids are in the car. So all the good classics from the mid to late 80s, early 90s.
By the way, I'll take the title of the youngest person in here. I'm 31. I'll be 32 October 13th. So you're good.
All right.
Ben, when did you first fall in love with hip hop?
Same time frame growing up, outside New York City in the mid 80s. First it was cassette tapes, Run DMC, Beastie Boys, dubbing my friends' tapes. And then, Video Music Box was like a local show with Ralph McDaniel where you could start to see rap videos. And then I remember fondly like Yo MTV Raps with Fab Five Freddy, and then the daily one with Dr. Dre and Ed Lover. And you know, I grew up in Westchester, so we had New Rochelle, you know, was right there. I was in Mamaroneck, but that was brand Nubian. Like you would see those guys sometimes. My friend's mom worked at a gym in Mount Vernon that Heavy D went to, as well as Puffy occasionally. That wasn't his name then, but that Sean Combs attended. So like the area, just you kind of felt close to it. And, you know, so certainly was loyal to New York hip hop. And then later, you know, I know we'll talk about Slam in a bit, but the founder and publisher of Slam founded where I started working in 1997, you know, when hip hop was still, you know, in a formative stage. He founded Double XL magazine, and the staff in the company was so teeny that we all basically worked on both. So I had an opportunity to be around it on like a professional level from, you know, 1997 till 2012, and for a large part of it, like actually worked on it. So fan from the 80s and being a kid in New York, and then got to meet a lot of artists, cover them, go to concerts, etc. You know, throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, thanks to Slam and Double XL. And like Dr. Moore, I don't, you know, listen to it as much as I used to, but, or I listen to old stuff if I do.
Certainly. And J.A., what about you?
I guess somebody has to be the oldest on the panel, so that would be me, born in 1970. So I'm older than hip hop if we're saying 1973 is the birth date. And so, yeah, I remember, you know, really the one that started it all in terms of pop culture and Rapper's Delight. And for purposes of this topic that we're getting into tonight, you know, the link between hip hop and basketball was right there. One of the lines, got a color TV so I can see the Knicks play basketball, you know, so that connection was forged from the get-go. And, you know, you heard it elsewhere, you know, Blondie, Rapture, you know, when she starts breaking out into rap, you know, from the get-go in a pop song, and she was kind of an early adopter of hip hop. But then, yeah, getting into Run DMC, you know, the Beastie Boys comes along. Funny hearing Ben say New Rochelle. I was actually in New Rochelle, even though I grew up in Santa Monica, California. You know, so I remember hearing Eazy-E and NWA early on as they got going on the West Coast, but I was actually on the East Coast in '87, and that was the epicenter of hip hop. And you know, when I spent the summer there, and I would tape, you know, Kiss FM, I guess, at night, and just to get some of those hip hop mixes and bring them back with me when I was home. And I was actually in New Rochelle on the 4th of July. And that was the first time I heard Public Enemy, Rebel Without a Pause. And someone was blasting it from their box. We're stuck in traffic, and you just hear this noise. Mm-hmm. and it was driving me crazy at first. And then I heard it on one of the DJ Red Alert mixes that I had taped, and I started getting into really love Public Enemy. I'd put them at the top. Tribe Called Quest, you know, that kind of 93 golden era. I remember hearing Boogie Down Productions and KRS-One, and I was just in my car one night and I heard My Philosophy, and that was the first time I really started hearing the lyrics, and the lyrics had some meaning to me. And you know, yeah, that mid 80s through mid 90s, I would say, you know, kind of up until we lost Biggie and Tupac, hip hop in some ways died for me along with them as well.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. I mean, my introduction is as G-rated as you can get, to say the least, because, you know, as a kid of the 90s, I grew up, my first exposure really to hip hop that I can remember was watching Nickelodeon. I used to watch Nickelodeon all the time when All That was on, and All That was sort of the equivalent of Saturday Night Live for us kids at the time. And they would always bring on hip hop acts. That was sort of like my first exposure to some of the biggest names at the time. And then, you know, obviously the introduction to the show, the song was created by TLC, which is, for me personally, my favorite group, period, regardless of genre. They're my favorite group of all time. You know, and that was sort of like my introduction to it. And I was just drawn to, you know, the music, the look, the sensibilities. And it wasn't until I got much older where I started to appreciate it a lot more and understand more the history of it, and, you know, how hip hop really sort of came to be and how it has really touched every aspect of our life. And then when it came to sports, I mean, obviously, you know, the connection to Michael Jordan. I mean, his relationship to hip hop is a lot more complicated, but nevertheless, the Jordan brand is certainly a major staple in hip hop culture. And so, just the look of the aesthetic, the Jordan brand, from the shoe to the clothing to Michael on the court, that really was hip hop to its fullest. And so that was sort of like my introduction to hip hop as a child of the 90s. So tonight we're talking about, college basketball especially. And we can't talk about it, without talking about what really got it started, which was the 1979 final between Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Michigan State, Indiana State, which is still the highest rated game in the history of college basketball. And that really started to increase the popularity of college basketball. But when we talk about hip hop, obviously, I think for most of us, or for most people, the first introduction was Georgetown. When you see Georgetown and Patrick Ewing, coached by John Thompson. I guess, Dr. Moore, I'll pose the question to you. When you think of Georgetown back in the day under John Thompson, what comes to mind to you?
Yeah, Hoya Paranoia, hair like mine. What's his Michael Graham? I'm still sporting my Michael Graham look, although I didn't play as rough as them. But just that, right? That very aesthetically pleasing, very in your face. And what's so weird is that, and this is no knock to anybody listening from DC, but we don't associate at that time DC with the hip hop scene, right? It's New York, it's West Coast. But they represented all that stuff. Oh yeah, DC was go-go, and shout out to Kid and Play for playing a lot of go-go in their music. I still haven't figured out what their producer Herb was doing, but it was awesome. But yeah, that's it for me. Just how ferocious they were on defense, or tenacious, whatever you want to say. And then it's the gear, right? It's I still want a Georgetown starter jacket. I still want shoes in their color. All that to me represented everything that I wanted to be in the 80s growing up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And J.A., John Thompson, he was just this unmistakable character. He was this, I forgot who put it this way. I think it was the Dr. Todd Boyd who said that he put the fear of God in you every time he stepped out onto the court. Did you ever get a chance to cover Georgetown? Did you ever get to talk to John?
So when I got to the Washington Post in 1994, at the same time as Allen Iverson, so I covered the Hoyas for 2 years, the 2 years that Iverson played there. And so at that point, they were very hip hop, and Iverson couldn't have been more hip hop, and he was actually starting his recording career, his rap career, while he was at Georgetown. He'd kind of sneak off, especially the spring of his sophomore year, and he was in the studio a lot. And so he was much more hip hop. So the 80s team and just the 80s in general, the flow was one way. So the basketball was influenced in the hip hop and is referenced in the hip hop, again, going back to Rapper's Delight, and Air Jordan brand became a very big part of hip hop culture, but Jordan himself wasn't referencing hip hop. He wasn't influenced by hip hop. He very famously, that when he hit that shot against Cleveland in 1989, and he's talking about before the game, he's listening to Anita Baker, giving you the best that I got. It's not exactly, listening to some hardcore, some NWA or something to get riled up. So, you're hearing Curtis Blow in the extended the original version of Basketball. He's talking about, name checking all these great players in the basketball rap. And in the chatter, not in the lyrics, but somewhere in the chatter, like he used to have in those songs, he does mention Michael Jordan and Ralph Sampson. And so some of those early 80s players, again, they're being referenced in hip hop, but you're not hearing the players referencing hip hop lyrics.
Mm-hmm. That's true. And then years later, Michael Jordan, he's on the bus before Game 6 of the 98 finals, before he hits the game winner in Game 6 to clinch the Suns title. He's listening to Kenny Lattimore. And
still, right? Even after hip hop had been well established, that's not what Michael Jordan was listening to.
No. And you mentioned, and I'm glad we mentioned him, because he came up, while he was at North Carolina, and he ends up playing against Georgetown in the 82 final and hits the game winner. And that was certainly before any kind of association could be made between Georgetown and hip hop. Ben, during your career at Slam Magazine, did you ever get a chance to cover any of the college game?
Yeah, I did cover a decent amount of college stuff. I also, not nearly as prolifically, but I also spent a year at the Washington Post, and then I would string for them, mostly college basketball. I did a bunch of St. John's games for them. And yeah, going back, I mean, my peak era was that late 80s as a fan. I think college basketball was literally my favorite sport over any other league, and now it's probably not in my top 10 as a fan. And I think kind of like Jay said, it went the influence of basketball on kind of culture and music was huge. And I think that until that, mid 80s, I mean, I guess NWA did it with the Raiders, but you also saw a lot of people wearing Georgetown, UNLV. Like until then, fan gear was not a thing. That was not a fashion statement. If anyone was wearing a college hat or t-shirt, or even a team, pro team hat or t-shirt, it was their favorite team. You would never wear it. That I just remember like I forget the brand, but the hats with the team would be in script. It would be like UNLV Rebels. Like you had people wearing, UNLV Rebels hats. They didn't know what UNLV stood for. Or maybe, I mean, it got dope. Like it was cool because someone realized UNLV is cool. But then the next man didn't even know why. Like the college basketball players made, influential fashion figures, rappers, guys in videos, the coolest kid at your school. They started wearing UNLV, Georgetown starter jacket, what have you. And then it just became like a fashion staple to where, yeah, you'd have people probably wearing college, t-shirts, hats, and not even knowing what it,
the joke was that people thought that Georgetown was an HBCU, right? Because they didn't know anything about the school. They just knew that they had a black coach and an all-black roster. And, they didn't know it was this prestigious university in Washington, D.C. They just knew it was this black team. And like Professor Moore said, you'd rock that Hoya starter jacket, either the blue one or the gray one. And there were people out there that thought it was an HBCU that didn't know any different.
And I think, though, real quick, Uncle Luke, I believe he was wearing Miami gear. Like he might have been Luke Skywalker back then. Might have been the first guy I realized wearing like the college gear. And that's just because he's a Miami guy, and those jackets were pretty clean at that time.
Mm-hmm.
For the younger folks, the starter jackets, these were the satin ones with the buttons, not the big hoodie ones like the Charlotte Hornets 1990s ones. These are the old ones, collar and the buttons up.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, I gotta admit, just when Dion was playing on Saturday, I was online trying to find a satin Colorado jacket, and I hope whoever remakes those satin jackets, they have to give me a Colorado one because I'm trying to get it before everyone else gets it. But that black and that yellow and that gold looks so clean. So hopefully whoever Fanatics or whoever remakes that stuff realizes that's going to be gold for them.
Yeah, I had as a kid. I had one of those big hoodie starter jackets. It was a Chicago Bulls one when I was a kid. So yeah, I know exactly what that was. And by the way, Dr. Moore, I'm actually glad that you mentioned Deion Sanders and Colorado, because I think you posted a tweet, if I recall, on Saturday during the game, where you sort of equated like the fandom that Colorado and Deion Sanders could sort of replicate what Georgetown had back in the day.
Yeah, and I think it was like young kids, this is your Georgetown, so embrace it. And what I meant, like obviously Colorado's not an HBCU, it's not even close, but sometimes people reference it. But just that culture that Deion's bringing in, having the Woo there, having hip hop artists there, and I think Colorado's going to be that cool brand. Unlike any other college, like you don't get that with Alabama, you won't get that with Georgia, no matter how good they are. Colorado's going to have this huge impression on a lot of young 20-year-old kids.
Can we talk about the Woo on the sidelines? Because, I mean, yeah, we've seen like Snoop on the sidelines of USC, or, Luke was heavily involved in Miami back in the day. But to have the Wu-Tang crew on the sidelines. But like, we don't see them together that much anymore. And here they were assembled on the sidelines in Boulder, Colorado, of all places. That was like a monumental moment in hip hop history, I thought.
Right.
Oh,
I gotta imagine it's not easy to get to, right? Like, I've never been to Boulder, but I don't know like how.
Well, the funny thing is that the airport is so far from Denver, let alone to Boulder. So, there's a lot of flights to Denver, but like getting from Denver to Boulder isn't that or from the Denver airport to Boulder isn't that easy. That's a good, probably close to 2 hours.
Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, it's just so, it's such a full circle in so many ways. And then, oh yeah, you all talking about the Georgetown starter jacket. Daryl McDaniel from Run DMC, he went to St. John's. I'm sure y'all probably know that. He went to St. John's and he actually had a Georgetown starter jacket at the time while he was at St. John's. He talked about that openly. And then Chuck D from Public Enemy, he was forming a group at the time before Public Enemy came to be, and he called them the Georgetown Gangsters. So that love was certainly there. And then, 1984 they win the national championship. They beat Houston, the Phi Slamma Jamma. I mean, Clyde Drexler, Akeem Olajuwon, you don't really hear them talked about within the context of hip hop as much as you do the other teams that we're going to talk about, including Georgetown. Why do you guys think that is?
My theory would be, you didn't have the Southern hip hop built up yet, so if you'd had the Ghetto Boys back then, if you'd had maybe, the Louisiana, the No Limit crew going, if they had come around earlier, maybe they would be hyping up Houston, because you're right. I mean, they were so far ahead of the way the game was being played, right? That was the next era coming in. And if hip hop was ushering in a new era of music and culture, that Houston team was really ushering in a new era of basketball. And so it would have been a perfect fit for this nascent art form. But I just don't think there was anyone in the region who really had the platform and the access to hype them.
Right. Yeah, no, I was gonna say I'd second that. Like Houston or Louisville, right? Both teams. But oddly, like whenever you hear Master P, and this is a basketball, they talk about basketball, he always says he had a chance to go to Houston or Louisville. I say it's BS because I've seen him play. He wasn't on that level. I'd never tell him that to his face, but that's like, so for him, that reference makes sense, right? And I think he understands that people of his age understand that, oh yeah, Houston and Louisville can ball, and they meant something, right? Because he could have made up any team. So there was, I think there's a lot of fandom around them, but it's not to the level of you're wearing their gear. I can't recall people wearing like Houston. Maybe it's the colors. I'm not like anti-red or anything like that. But maybe it's just it's not as clean. That Georgetown works because that gray and that Hoya blue or whatever you call it, it's very clean looking, right? Whereas maybe the Houston didn't produce a nice looking product, but Jay is right. No, I mean that Ghetto Boys doesn't come out for a few years later. And even them, I can't remember what they're wearing on those covers, but I doubt it's like Houston. I have to look. I doubt it's like the Houston. They're not rocking Houston, whatever Cougar stuff.
Mm-hmm. What's Ben? What say you?
I mean, I think a couple things. Like the Big East had, at least on the East Coast, but probably nationally, they had the TV deal, so they were on a little bit more. And I think like UNLV in my memory would be the first, like, not maybe big market team that was pop. Like in '84, rap videos weren't really quite a thing. Louisville did win in '86, but with Purvis Ellison, I mean, the super cool Louisville teams with, Daryl Griffith and Doctors of Dunk or whatever, that was maybe 79, 1980. So I just think if Houston, Phi Slamma Jamma, or the Louisville squad that went 31-1, those national championship teams, if they were a couple years later, you would have seen those, their gear. It's just they were a little early. Georgetown had, I think, a little more media attention, easier to watch. And Thompson was also such a, they were even more striking. Maybe their basketball wasn't as high flying as Louisville and Houston, but Georgetown was very memorable for the racial makeup of the team and the coach, as well as like the physical way they played. And they were on, I think, more regular season. Again, Big East was like, ESPN was just, we had access to so many Big East games all of a sudden. And then rap videos were taking off in the late 80s in a way that they weren't really happening yet earlier. Plus the obvious points these guys made about Houston rap scene didn't really exist yet, and Louisville's, barely does even to this day. So there weren't, nationally famous celebrities, representing them.
I think it's important to remember you're not hearing hip hop in the basketball arenas at that point in the 80s. It's not being played in the NBA arenas. The NBA is kind of just catching up to pop. I heard a great podcast where they talk about how the Pointer Sisters. You probably heard the Pointer. They became like the official soundtrack of the NBA, right? In the NBA Fantastic commercials. But that's not hip hop, right? So it's still lagging. Hip hop is coming to prominence, but you're not hearing it associated officially with basketball in official capacity. You're not hearing the marching bands or the school bands playing hip hop songs the way you'd be likely to now. So you're not hearing it in the games. You're maybe seeing it referenced again. You're seeing it represented by the clothing in hip hop, but you're not having it officially associated. Again, it's not coming in the other direction into the arenas and being officially associated with it. You really don't get that until the 2000s, at least in the NBA.
That's true. And then with the, kind of bringing, and then when we get into the early 90s, that's when we get UNLV, and then we get the Fab Five from Michigan. That's where it's a lot more evident, or it's a lot more in your face, or it's a lot, there's a certain discussion that needed to be had at the time, because that also coincided with the ever-growing rise of hip-hop and how hip-hop really started to become a major staple in American culture. Like in the beginning, in the 80s, it was just little by little, but it was still mostly somewhat underground until the 90s come along, and then it explodes, and then it's pretty much impacted every aspect of American life, to the point where I think it was the first George Bush, when he was in the White House. I forget. Yeah, the first George Bush, when he used the word "diss" in a speech. I don't know if y'all remember that.
I don't remember him using that word.
Oh yeah, I came across this not too long ago. Just doing some research, and I was just looking up stuff, and I think it was the first George Bush when he was in the White House, when he was giving a speech or he was giving an interview about some subject, and he used the word "diss," and that was sort of like the first reference of hip hop in the White House. Before Barack Obama and down the line, I guess, but. Yeah, and then obviously, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Jay.
I really think of the Fab Five and the Michigan teams as the first real hip hop college basketball team. Even though maybe UNLV had been adopted, they didn't. They don't strike me. And maybe it's because I spent more time. So I really, especially the sophomore year of the Fab Five, I was covering college basketball at the Chicago Sun-Times at that time, and I did a lot of their games, including at the Final Four. And you go up to Ann Arbor and practice, and like you heard hip hop. They loved EPMD. That was kind of like the unofficial theme music of the Fab Five. That all the EPMD songs we playing in the locker room almost constantly when you go up there. Of course, the baggy shorts, which they didn't really initiate. I'd go back to the 88, 89 Illinois, the Flying Illini. They kind of took the baggy shorts to a new level. I'd say the Fab Five made it more popular. And I'll never forget, they won a game late in the season in '93. It might have been at Michigan State. And they're up on the table and they're doing the hip hop parade, waving their hands back and forth. So here you see the players directly referencing hip hop, citing hip hop lyrics all the time, hip hop moves, hip hop parade, all that stuff. the Fab Five really, to me, were the first college team that embraced and was a hip hop team.
No doubt, no doubt. All right, guys. So we're gonna take a little break here. We're gonna thank some sponsors, and then we'll come back and we'll discuss more. We'll talk more about college basketball and hip hop, UNLV, the Fab Five. We'll talk about Arkansas. We'll talk about Georgia Tech. We'll talk about everybody when we come back. Keep watching Game Recognized Game.
Streetwear is not dead. The next wave of black fashion comes out of the Bronx, New York. Rich Kid Clothing, picking up where FUBU, Rockaware, and Kyle Kanai left off. Rich Kid is for the next generation of Get Fly fashion heads. Use promo code MELLOW23 for 15% off your next order. And for orders over $100, there is free shipping. Again, use promo code MELLOW23 for 15% off your next order.
In 2006, we founded Yeti Coolers with a simple mission: build a cooler we use every day if it existed. One that was built for the serious outdoor enthusiasts rather than for mass discount retailers. One that could take the abuse we knew we'd put it through, out in the field and on the water. One that simply wouldn't break. We decided early on that production innovation would come from necessity and first-hand experience, not from market research and data analysis. Today, Yeti products perform when it matters most. Whether that be an excursion into the remote Alaskan wilderness, chasing redfish on the Gold Coast, or just getting together with friends in the backyard, we make gear that helps you stay out longer, travel farther, and live harder. Hashtag built for the wild.
All right, we are back with Game Recognized Game with Dr. Lewis Moore, J.A. Adande, and Ben Osborne. So we left off talking about Michigan Fab Five, but before we get more into them, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about UNLV. Like what you were saying earlier, J.A., yeah, UNLV, technically they were a hip-hop team, but it wasn't as evident as it was with the Michigan Fab Five. Ben, let me turn this over to you because you and I have talked, and we talked about, UNLV. We're talking about Stacey Augmon, Larry Johnson, Greg Anthony playing under the incredible Jerry Tarkanian as head coach. We've talked before, what were some of your memories of them and the impact that they had?
I mean, I think that they, quite literally were rebels. That was their name. Tark the Shark was constantly at war with the NCAA, really wanted to, in his mind, he was doing a great service to, giving kids a chance. And in many cases that proved correct. To the NCAA, he was cheating. To critics, it was kids who didn't deserve to play college basketball maybe. So they leaned into, the rebellious aspect. And I think particularly at that phase, 89, 90, I mean, hip hop had some breakthroughs, but as we've discussed, it was not yet mainstream. So it wasn't the same direct line as the Michigan team, or maybe even the Georgetown one. But I think a lot of young people that liked hip hop felt that they were acting out, they were being rebellious, and that team kind of lived up to that in your face. And they beat a Duke team by 30 points in a very memorable kind of, beating that just kind of signified the Rebels were victorious in this moment. And they had a cool logo, they had good colors, and yeah, I think of them as the college, that was kind of the college apparel after Georgetown that really took off. And I think it was the style of play, it was the coach, and even the city was not nearly as mainstream as it is now. There was no pro sports teams there. It was just about the only place you could bet on sports. Like, there was an air of danger around them. And then, added kind of kick for New York hoops junkies like myself, one of their big scandals was Lloyd Daniels, who was a, Queens, Brooklyn playground legend that I had read an amazing book on, the Sweepy book, that was like influential to me and I think a lot of New York basketball fans, and that just that made UNLV even kind of more prominent to us. And Richie Adams, Moses Scurry, Tark was recruiting New York, so there was like, if you were into New York hoops, you also were like hearing about UNLV, and in that regard, and New York didn't have a team other than St. John's. So again, I was young, so my perspective, now I'm a professional journalist, been in the game, but, at that age, I'm still biased by like what I'm exposed to. And UNLV had like an outsized place in my life, again, because of the New Yorkers, because of Tark, and just a lot of kids I know just gravitated to that team.
Yeah, and then you had in Tupac's Brenda's Got a Baby video where he is rocking UNLV gear. That, I think, if I recall, that's sort of like I'm sure there were others, ones I couldn't personally find, but that was like the one big correlation where hip hop showed love to UNLV, and who better?
I think Uptown Anthem too from Juice. I think Tretch is wearing.
Oh, Tretch from Naughty by Nature?
Yeah, is wearing UNLV.
It's pretty amazing how a Confederate soldier, which is what the logo was, and what the rebels were referencing, could become, popular in hip hop culture. But you just have to understand, like in the 80s, the Dukes of Hazzard with the card of General Lee with a Confederate flag on it and a horn that played, Dixie. This was revered in hip hop, right? And Luke Skywalker is singing about the Daisy Dukes, right? That comes from the Dukes of Hazzard, which had a Confederate-based vehicle, Confederate icon vehicle as a centerpiece. And I don't understand. It's hard to explain 1980s me, loving the General Lee and playing cars with Matchbox cars with the General Lee, and same thing. People rocking the Confederate soldier UNLV Runnin Rebels logo, but times are different then.
Yeah, it's true. And Dr. Moore, as a historian, how does that all come to be? How do you make sense of all that as a historian?
You can't. But I'll just say real quick. I did make a mistake earlier on the Ghetto Boys' first album on Grip It on the Level. Willie D is wearing a Houston Cougar shirt. It is a cutoff Houston Cougar shirt. So I did look it up during that little break.
What year is that?
I don't know. It's the Grip It on the Level cover, so it's got to be late 80s, early 90s.
So that's like after the heyday, the Five Slamma Jamma era, right?
Right. So it's before, like, it might be right before they get Bushwick or something. I don't know. The group was changing so much at that time. But how do you make sense of like the General Lee? I mean, it's just like, look. I mean, it's the same way of understanding these kids in post integration in the South went to Ole Miss, right? And they had to deal with this. Or it's the same way we make sense of the kids that go to Alabama and watch their fans yell at the Texas players, right? It's just sometimes things it's really hard to explain, right? But also some others it's a weird relationship. I'm not from the South, but they might see sometimes like the Dukes of Hazzard a little bit differently. But Hollywood has always Hollywood things, right? I think that's the best way to say it. Like Gone with the Wind is probably one of the most popular movies ever in American history, and it's about slavery. I think the most popular movie ever when it comes to like box office appeal is the Birth of a Nation, right? Mm-hmm. The old Birth of a Nation, and that is a Klan movie. And this is all what Hollywood does. So I mean, that's how you can make sense of it. And I don't think any young kid is really thinking like, oh, this is like Jay said, these are the Running Rebels. Like it takes a while to like actually put that together. Like, why in the heck would UNLV have a Confederate anthem or soldier as a mascot, which also we have to beg the question, like, why does Arizona have the most Confederate monuments, right? Part of that is just the spread of racism across America, right, and the Southwest.
Mm-hmm. One thing with UNLV, it's interesting because between UNLV, their run, and between the rise of the Fab Five, and interconnected with the two is Duke. And yeah, I'm about to talk about Duke in a hip hop conversation, but it's interesting because of UNLV and what happens with them and Duke, it helps make the Fab Five rebels, so to speak, because the Duke was the scrappy underdog in 1990. It's hard, 3 decades of Duke being the dominant, the establishment, but they get blown out, as you mentioned, in the 1990 championship game, and then they're heavy underdogs because that whole UNLV squad comes back. Larry Johnson, Stacey Augmon, Greg Anthony, etc. They all come back when they could have very easily come pro, and they're running through the tournament once again, and then Duke upsets them. Nobody saw that coming. And so Duke a lot of people were rooting for Duke, because they were the underdogs. And especially if you feared what UNLV was, then Duke could be the proxy for something else. But then Duke flips from the underdog. A year later, they're playing the Fab Five in the championship game. And now Duke is the establishment. And it's very easy to paint these upstart, all freshmen, very hip hop swaggy Michigan as the outsiders against the establishment, which was Duke. But just a year earlier, Duke had been the underdogs. Duke had kind of been in the position that Michigan was without all the flavor. And then Duke is the establishment, really right up until now for the last 3 decades. But Michigan helped make them that by providing that contrast. But I've never seen just perception flip like it did in 1 year from Duke being the underdog to Duke being the establishment. But again, the presence of the Michigan Wolverines helped make Duke look like the establishment that next year.
Yeah, and I would say too, one thing I forgot to mention, when UNLV does win, there's this great Larry Johnson quote, and I'm paraphrasing, and he's like, "You can call us hoodlums, you can call us thugs, but you also have to call us national champions too." Right. And this is like right after it's a record of how bad they beat the team. And that UNLV team is amazing when you think about it. As Ben was saying, like, Tark is collecting players from all over, right? Stacey Augmon's from, Pasadena, LA area. LJ's from Dallas. Anderson Hunt's from Detroit. The guy from Brooklyn that he mentioned, right? So it's a collection of guys from all these urban areas, and even someone, Greg Anthony from Las Vegas, you wouldn't think it is an urban area, but if I'm correct, North Vegas is the segregated side, and Anthony himself grows up in poverty, and so Tark it's not like this regional school, or it's not like John Thompson pulling people from the East Coast. He's pulling guys from every kind of major city, and he created a team like out of LJ is a transfer. It's a junior college transfer, probably Stacey Augmon, right? And he's creating these guys on the fly. And I think that kind of represents kind of this very urban appeal that they have, because it's this conglomerate of guys from the cities of all across America, right? And now they're in your face. I mean, they're on the West Coast, so you don't really get to see them, play Santa Barbara. But they're in their face. And that's, as Jay is saying, that Duke team, I think beating UNLV, they're hated, right? Because that's kids, that's my generation's favorite team, that UNLV team. Like, you can't tell me it's not the greatest team ever. And all of a sudden they're losing. And it's not just Christian, it's Grant Hill, right? And I think as much as we talk bad about Christian Laettner, and I hate Christian Laettner, I think Grant Hill is part of that, right? Part of that hatred, because I think Jalen brings it up. I don't know him on a first name basis, but in that Fab Five 30 for 30, how Grant Hill is juxtaposed, right? And throughout his career, until he gets hurt, Grant Hill is used by the media. He's used by the NBA to say that we're not hip hop, right? Like, we are, like, as at the same time the NBA is flirting with hip hop, they're bringing in Grant Hill to say we're anything but that. And it's interesting to think about, if Grant Hill doesn't get hurt and he actually makes it to that MJ level that many people thought he would be, what happens to somebody like an Allen Iverson, right? In that context, where there's Grant Hill, who's really should have been the face of the NBA.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And you can make the same case. You mentioned Allen Iverson, Dr. Moore. Sort of how he was put up against. By the time he came around after he left Georgetown and was with the Sixers, Michael Jordan was on the way out, and in comes Kobe Bryant, and Kobe Bryant is seen as the next face of the NBA, and they certainly made sure that it wasn't going to be Allen Iverson in the same way that they made sure that it wasn't going to be a guy like Latrell Sprewell, right, after the incident with PJ Carlesimo. So they were very meticulous in picking and choosing who they wanted to be sort of the face of their team, the face of their league, the face of their school, to sort of fit into this definition of respectability as hip-hop is sort of coming in and uprooting all of that.
Right.
And then
can we say something? Can we skip it and talk Ja? Because I think Ja, I'm sorry, but I think Ja is dealing with that, right? Like Ja made some very stupid decisions, but I think what hurts the NBA even more is that they thought he was next, and the hip hop that he is connected to is not, and not like your 90s Will Smith stuff. And I think the NBA is disappointed because they had him pegged as like this next U.S. player that they can market as being hip and cool, and it kind of backfired on them. Sorry to kind of.
Oh no, you're good. It's a good point. And since we're talking about Duke, you go fast forward 20, 30 years later, and then you get Zion Williamson, and you get all the other guys that are playing with him, and then all of a sudden Duke is seen as cool again. It's seen, maybe not necessarily through the lens of hip hop, but still is seen as a cool team and something to get behind and something to relate to. Whereas, like J.A. said, they were the establishment. They were a team that everybody hated except if you lived in Durham. So, and then Zion comes along and he puts on a show, and then he goes to the NBA, and I don't know if we should go there, but he's not really seen in such or he was seen as a hype man in the same way that Ja Morant was seen as a hype man, to your point, Dr. Moore. And then, since, talking about the Michigan Fab Five, now you mentioned the 30 for 30. The sports documentaries have always been, around. Sports documentaries have always, garnered attention and praise for its content and, the everything that comes with it, the production value. But I get the sense that, the 30 for 30 about the Fab Five really sort of paved the way for other documentaries, the 30 for 30 documentaries, to be as popular as they are now. I don't know. I think probably because of the Jalen Rose's comments about Grant Hill certainly garnered much attention, but just the documentary as a whole about the Fab Five that told their story, I feel like that sort of paved the way for other really groundbreaking sports documentaries to come down the pike leading up to The Last Dance. That's just my hunch. What say you guys?
I mean, that team just was, endlessly fascinating to people. And I think that if you were our age, then it was a great way to look back, much the same way Last Dance was. And it also had, I think, crossover. It was an interesting enough story that younger people liked it too. I mean, not the Bulls that was like next level. Obviously, that was global culture and influence. But Zach, I think you're right that on a smaller scale, the Fab Five is one of the most kind of famous teams or collection of athletes of the last 30 or 40 years. And yes, I mean, I'm not shocked, but I do think it made a good case for the validity of sports docs about interesting teams. They were a good a good proving ground for that, for sure.
Well, again, I think that was the first of those 30 for 30s and those sports docs overall that really did appeal to the young hip hop generation, people that came up in the 90s, I'd say, maybe one generation behind me, those are, so I'm basically, I was a senior when the Fab Fives were freshmen. So, I'm a little bit older than them, but that was the first, now you have the kids that were watching them love that team because they saw themselves. That was, again, I really believe that was the first hip hop team. So now you've got a generation that has only known hip hop, right? Didn't know a time before hip hop. and they see that hip hop team, and then to go back to their youth and be reminded of when that team just burst onto the scene. The anticipation for that documentary. I remember I was so excited. I couldn't wait for that one. And I think they delivered. It was a great documentary. It's got one of the all-time great transition lines ever when Jalen Rose says, and then came the crack house incident. That's one of the best setups ever. But again, I think that was you could say that was the first hip hoppy sports documentary because it was inescapable when you're talking about that team.
Absolutely. And you had Ice Cube featured on there. You had Chuck D featured on there talking about their love for the Fab Five and how they saw themselves in them when they stepped out onto the floor. I do have to ask you this, J.A., because you said that you were working for the Chicago Sun-Times at the time. Mm-hmm. So you were in the Superdome.
I was in the Superdome, covered the Fab Five in the Superdome, the timeout, all that. I was on the court, sitting courtside, that whole sequence.
Oh my God! Take us through that moment when Chris Webber calls the timeout.
Well, it's funny because first right in front of me, he almost traveled. He gets the rebound and he kind of almost traveled, and then so that was on the side of the court that I was sitting. Then they go down to the other side, and he's in the corner, and so it was a little hard for me to tell what was happening at first because it was on the far end of the court, and there's some players kind of blocking my view. But he runs down there and he calls timeout. And there's a couple Michigan players, I won't name them, but you see, like a couple of them are clapping, like, yeah, timeout. And then the coaches are like, no, we don't have a timeout. I'll just never forget how somber Chris Webber, he comes in, faces all the media, and he just repeatedly is hanging his head and he's repeatedly said, I called a timeout. We didn't have a timeout. I probably cost our team the game. Everyone else was trying to pick him up. I'll never forget the line that Jalen Rose had. Well, first, as they win in the semifinals on Saturday, he's running off the court back to the tunnel. And he goes, "We're back. The villains are back." They really embraced that villain role, that outsider role, the Rebels. And after they lose, and so they've lost back to back. And Jalen Rose says, "You know what? I'd rather be the Fab Five getting to the championship game 2 years in a row and losing than the Fab Five sitting at home cooking fries watching the championship game on TV." And that was just the Jalen. He was kind of like the Flavor Flav of the group, the court jester. He wound up being, producing. He's become this great media mogul. But he was definitely the comic relief on that team, but also the great perspective on that team.
Jay, you had the Bullets with Webber and Jawan. Correct?
Yeah. So the Fab Five reunion.
Did they particularly maybe because they were aware of either directly to you if they remembered that you'd covered them or even just you being around, did they reflect on, did they talk about that time a lot or was it like in the past, did they,
it's weird. Not a whole lot, it wasn't a lot of Fab Five. I'll say what there was a lot of that I had to see Chris Webber endure was, on the road, all the hecklers like, timeout. Hey, Webber, call timeout. It took him a long time to get past that. Mm-hmm. And so kind of more than when they first got together, they at a similar stage, I think, they draft Juwan Howard, then they make a trade for Chris Webber after his rookie season in Golden State and had a very contentious exit from Golden State. But yeah, there was a lot of, Fab Five reunion initially. So I didn't cover the team their first year together. So I believe it was their second year together. I covered the team, and yeah, they knew me. They remembered me from being around that team. Again, I was around them a lot the sophomore year of the Fab Five, but we didn't spend a lot of time talking about it. But I do remember constantly on the road, Chris Webber being heckled. Timeout. I'll never forget one time they're lining up for a free throw. Webber's lying on the side in rebounding position. Hey, Webber, timeout. Call timeout, Webber. So he turns around, looks at the guy, goes, "Timeout. Okay, you happy?" And it was really sad. I felt bad for him. It took him a long time to shake that, and to not be defined and not have that hanging over him. I mean, the thing is, if they win that game, he's probably the MVP of the Final Four. He played incredible. Nobody's going to remember how well he played in that championship game. They just remember the timeout.
And real quick, as we back up, on that 30 for 30, I'd say part of it, the appeal is that it is college basketball. We knew those guys, whereas the other stuff they do on college, I think they've done Miami 2 or 3 times. They did the Pony Excess, and then they did Dupree. there's no real familiarity. People know them because they know college, but we know the Fab Five, right? And so it makes so sense. And then on Chris Webber, I think it's fair to say he's probably that first NBA player that you would associate with a different type of hip hop, right? It's not like that clean cut. And then so his rookie year, if I'm not mistaken, he's in those Nike commercials, right? And then afterwards, those barbershop Nike commercials, which is a very hip hop thing. And I think they, him dunking on Barkley and stuff like that and talking trash. I think it's that right there is probably that moment where the NBA is really leaning into that.
And the Huaraches, right? The Nike Air Huaraches we associate with that team. They really broke those out.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And I wonder, since we're on the subject of the 30 for 30, and to your point, J.A., about how it took years for Chris Webber to sort of get over the timeout incident, I wonder if that, along with certainly the discussion about Ed Martin and the relationship that he and Jalen had with Ed Martin and how that led to the Fab Five's records essentially being obliterated by the University of Michigan. I sometimes wonder if those two factors were why he didn't participate in the documentary. Like the other four did, but he didn't, and he declined. And I'm wondering if it's because of that, along with, maybe at that time when it came out, he was still trying to come to terms with the timeout and just didn't want to talk about it.
I think there's variety. I've never talked to Chris directly about this. But I think it's been reported that, I think he felt blamed, that some blame was put on him for calling the timeout. And then that he was the one. So he was the only one that kind of didn't kind of deal with it. And remember, he got in trouble, I believe for perjury in the Ed Martin case, so I think he didn't come clean like everyone else did. So he paid the biggest price for the Ed Martin. And, he was associated with sort of the on the court, the darkest moment for the Fab Five. So there's a lot of negative associations for him with Michigan. I mean, I was glad when they did finally kind of get back together. I think he went to one of their tournament games, right? I want to see them whole. I want to see Jalen and Grant Hill bury the hatchet. I just want Pete, because I was around all those guys. I've had great relationship with all those guys. I want to see them all get along. And good. I mean, Chris's voice was noticeably absent, like he's got such a great voice and he was so profound and, and I love talking to him. So as great as that documentary was, imagine how much better it would have been with Chris Webber's participation. And I just kind of want to hear his perspective on college sports. And I think as we look at the NIL era now, you have to go back to that Fab Five team really pointing out the hypocrisy of so many people profiting off them and them not being allowed to do so legally. So in this NIL era, Chris Webber's voice is as relevant as ever because he was speaking out about this 30 years ago, and it took 3 decades for the NCAA and everything else to catch up to what they were talking about back then.
Oh my God. And I mean, Dr. Moore, I'll pose this question to you. Like, the Fab Five, they were so far ahead of their time in more ways than one. I mean, they knew like what they were up against and they knew how the game was being played. And then you fast forward 30 years later and we have NIL, I guess, the Fab Five of Michigan, I guess it's short-sighted to put into context today that, hey, let's give them their banners, let's give them their records back, let's give them everything that had been stripped away from them. But I think going forward in the era of NIL, how do we move forward so that what happened to the Fab Five doesn't happen again?
Yeah, it's tough, right? Real quick about the Fab Five. I was on a panel with Jimmy King one time about the Huaraches, and he was talking about the Huaraches, and he said they intentionally wore those Huaraches just to see how Nike sales shifted, because Huaraches aren't basketball shoes, right? Like, who in their right mind would play basketball in Huaraches? And they did that just to see, right, how much they would have, and they took off, and they're still today. You can go get, I have a couple pair of Huaraches and I still want the all black ones, but they'll run you like 110, right? So you can still go to Foot Locker or wherever you buy sneakers. I'm old, so I say Foot Locker, and buy various pairs of Huaraches. And it's all because of these young kids who got, as you say, got nothing. When it comes to NIL today, I think the one thing that's so interesting to me, if you read enough about college sports, everybody was cheating, right? Cheating, and whatever that means, because to me, I don't think it's cheating. Like, these kids deserve to get paid, right? Like, whatever it's the pony excess, whatever, however much money Ed Martin got to steer Jalen and them there, every team was doing that before them and after them. And to me, the most important thing when we talk NIL is just to have an adult in the room. I think it's I don't know if we necessarily have to make sure Reggie gets his Heisman. He should, but what's even worse is if there's not an adult in the room or a lawyer or something like that. Because if we look at what happened to that guy from the Chicago Bears, right, his contract with Florida, they were robbing him for the rest of his life. And I can't believe that nobody stepped in at the University of Florida and said, this is not okay. Like, you can't have this deal. So to me, the thing with NIL is on the colleges to make sure you got a tax person there, make sure you have a lawyer there looking over, a money person there. And then after that, let the kids do what they want to do. If they want to go and buy Hellcats, let them buy Hellcats, right? Because that's what freedom's about. You should counsel them and tell them not to do that, but freedom is about being able to do these things.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about the Huaraches, I'm wondering, what else do you think, as we see now the influence going from basketball back the other way, what were some of the other like hip hop basketball shoes, that really were sort of co-equal? Again, Jordan was outsized influence, but he wasn't listening to hip hop. So how is hip hop shaping what these guys are wearing and styling?
I'm just waiting for the slam.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, the shoes have been a huge part of it. I mean, we started with the Georgetown. Obviously, the Terminator had its fans, and I don't know. I mean,
I would say my buddy just sent me a picture of those Terminators. I think you can get them for $110 now. So there you go. Those David Robinson shoes. What are those? The Air Force. I know Ice Cube had Ewings on, or referenced white Ewings in what? Yeah. What song was that? It wasn't Good Day. It was something
that's on the America's Most Wanted, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
What about the shoes the specialized shoes that Shaq had? What about those?
Yeah.
I'm just saying, like those. I think I had a pair of those when I was a kid. Shaq had his own shoe.
Chris Webber had a pair with Dada that had spinning rims on them.
The spinning rim Dadas, the BK, all those are awful. The British Knights, the Clyde Pumas. My buddy just talked to me. Spud was wearing ponies.
Yeah.
But Reebok Blacktop, to me, that is not a basketball shoe. But if you ever go back, if you go to YouTube or whatever and put in those Reebok Blacktop commercials, those are all hip hop, right? Like here
I mean, the Iverson with Jadakiss, right? I mean, that was one of the pivotal moments, right? In the hip hop basketball fuse. A lot of people point to that Iverson Jadakiss Reebok commercial.
And one was certainly hugely crossed over. That was like a lifestyle as much as it was a basketball shoe, and had its moments.
And I got to do this because Dominique Wilkins is the greatest player ever, but not only his Brooks, but the Reebok pumps. So I'll just, since we all know that Dominique's the greatest player ever.
He wore the Arsenal, the Brooks Arsenal KWs. I went and bought those because
I have a Brooks poster of Dominique Wilkins right now in my office wall. You can't see it because it's a mess in here, but yeah.
That's dope. And Dr. Moore, you had the audacity to say that Dominique Wilkins is the greatest player who ever lived.
Yeah. There's no, I'll say this. There's no, I mean, people argue. So I'm just going to throw out who I like. And then there he is. I mean, look, he plays in today's game. He's averaging 40. I mean, he put up 30 in 1986 with 23 teams, right? And hand checking. That's very hard to do. And not really shooting threes. And he won that dunk contest. So.
Fair enough.
I'll keep going. Give him Joe Dumars. Give him Bill. Give him these All-Stars. Give him Scottie Pippen. Give him Robert Parrish. Give him 4 Hall of Famers. He's the only guy of these guys that, I mean, no knock on Doc Rivers, but he wasn't it, right? Like if your second best player is Randy Whitman and Isaiah is playing with all-stars, you're in trouble.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, there's something to be said about that. I mean, that's why these debates are endless and they never go away. I do want, with the time that we have left, I do want to, sort of talk about sort of like those college teams that sort of go under the radar, like they hit it big in the moment and then they sort of fade into obscurity, like the Fab Five and UNLV, Georgetown, like they all have longevity for obvious reasons. But, my guy, Mello Williams, who's my co-host, he knows Kenny Anderson, and Kenny Anderson obviously played for Georgia Tech as part of the Lethal Weapon 3. They got to the 90 Final Four, and they lost to UNLV in the semifinal before UNLV obliterated Duke. And then you kind of fast forward 4 years later, and then you have Arkansas under Coach Nolan Richardson. They win the national title in 94. They were a very flashy team. They sort of kind of slip under the radar. And I'm guessing that's probably because it was kind of like a fleeting moment and they didn't really have anything to their game or anything to their style or the personnel necessary to sort of garner that kind of longevity to where all these years later we kind of remember them. Unless you're a big basketball aficionado, then you certainly know them. But, by historically speaking, they're kind of, not really recognized as much.
I think you get into, and this sort of starts, in the Fab Five era. It's not that they pioneered it, but, guys leaving after their sophomore year. Yep. Dak leaves after his sophomore year. So you don't get these college teams together 2-3. I mean, one thing about Duke, love them or hate them, you knew them, because they stayed together 3-4 years. And so you got to know these people. And they were always on TV. And then, of course, you get in the mid-90s, Kevin Garnett and Kobe go straight. They skip college entirely. And so you have a whole generation. And then, once they put in the one and done rule, you've only got Kevin Durant for, you don't think of his time at Texas. You don't think very few of these guys, you think of their college times. I mean, the whole thing with the Fab Five was them, especially Weber, coming back for the sophomore year. They basically, 5 freshmen go to the championship game and then they run it back the next year. And we did see the Florida team come back and win back-to-back championships, not just go to the championship, win back-to-back championships. But, maybe you guys can explain why they never really had any cachet. They don't resonate, Zachary, to your point, like some of those other teams did.
Right. I would say they don't resonate as you were saying because the guys were gone, right? And so like who cares? Like it's great. Like I mean I'm more worried about how Ronnie Brewer actually scored like 50 points in a game or whatever.
Like Joakim Noah came back, right? He could have gone.
He came back.
But they're boring. Like Noah and Horford are just like they're like boring. They're not exciting. But to your point about that Arkansas team, I actually go a little bit further back with Lee Mayberry and Todd Day, right? Like to me, that was that team. And part of that is I think Dick Vitale was such a voice, right? And why these guys aren't getting paid, but he's pumping them up. And so you come out thinking you watch NC State and you think Fire and Ice with Chris Corchiani and what is it, Rodney Monroe? You think they're the greatest pair ever, right? Just because Vitale is selling them. He's selling Todd Day and Lee Mayberry. And those early LSU teams with Chris Jackson before it comes Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, you get the sense that these are the greatest ever, like Lethal Weapon 3. They have a name. They have 3 good players. And part of that is just Dick Vitale being this hype man as we grow up. And now they're on TV. As Ben was saying, Big East had that package, that TV package. Monday. And then as we grow up, everybody seems to be like, now they're on TV and we get used to it. And then boom. The age restriction goes away, right? Those guys test the waters and the good players are gone. And 90s, and I think Ben was saying it, like college basketball is not his thing as much anymore. And that's because those guys left. Like, if I'm recalling right, like late 90s, early 2000 college basketball wasn't good at all. Because literally everybody, even if they were a top 20 player, they're like, I'm, Diop, whoever that is, right? That guy probably should have gone to college for like 5 years, but in the pros, he's a top 5 pick, or Eddie Curry and Tyson Chandler, right? Those guys what would have been if they had 2 years of the machine of college basketball pumping them up.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, I think about just in terms of a classic moment, you think about when UCLA won in 1995, and that was the first time in, I think 20 years up until that point since they had won a national title. Obviously, they were the dynasty in the late 60s, early 70s. John Wooden, Bill Walton, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Jamal Wilkes, all those guys. They win in 75, which was their 10th. And then for 20 years, they didn't win until 95 when Tyus Edney hit the buzzer beater. I forget which game that was.
Missouri. It was Missouri.
That was opening weekend. Yeah.
Round, right. Over there. Didn't Missouri have like 2 tall twins or something? Like, if I remember correctly, they had like these twins.
Probably.
They were like 7-footers. Yeah.
Yeah. And I did some research for this episode, and I found out that Tyus, to try to find a connection to hip hop, I come to find out that Tyus actually said that when UCLA won, after UCLA won in 95, he receives a bottle of champagne in the mail from Queen Latifah. Like Queen Latifah was a huge UCLA fan apparently, and he says that he gets this bottle of, I think it was Cristal, in the mail, and it's from Queen Latifah because she was so congratulating him on them winning the national championship. I was so flabbergasted and so excited when I heard about that, because I thought that is such a cool connection that happened that from afar. Like I didn't find any pictures of her at any of their games or anything like that, like EPMD at watching the Fab Five, but I thought that was such a cool connection and a cool moment there. It's funny how that works.
That's funny.
Yeah. So just got a couple of minutes before I get into what I have left for you guys in the time that we have. I mean, just the college game has changed so much, and it's really, started by these teams that have such cachet in the culture. Like they, make college basketball the game that it is today, in so many ways. But yeah, with the time that I have left with you guys, we'll play a little game of One Gotta Go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give each of you, I want to hear from all three of you. I want to hear with the teams that we've been talking about, one's got to go. So like one's got to go and you got to explain why they got to go. So, I mean, just for argument's sake, with the teams that we've been talking about, we'll put in Georgetown, we'll put in UNLV, and we'll put in the Michigan Fab Five. So out of all three of them, one got to go. So let me see who I can start with. Ben, why don't I start with you?
Yes.
Dr. Moore's relieved.
That's so hard. I mean, they're all amazing. I'm going to say Michigan. They didn't win, and they had UNLV and to some degree Georgetown to look up to. So I think those would be the only. UNLV, I think, is the coolest, most, that's my number one. So they're super safe between Georgetown and Michigan. I'm going to say Michigan's got to go. I think Coach Thompson was more influential, and they didn't win. The other two teams won a title. So as cool as the Fab Five were, they're out.
J.A.
I gotta send UNLV out. They gotta go. Probably personal. I covered Georgetown. I covered a lot of the Fab Five. Juwan and Chris. I worked with Greg Anthony at ESPN, so it's not like I don't have any personal connection to those teams. But in some ways, Ben, it's almost cooler that the Fab Five live on, even though they didn't win. They're just so influential. I feel like their influence lasts the longest and affects more younger people than either of those other two teams, even though they didn't win. And again, it goes back to, I think they're the first real hip hop college team.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Moore.
Oh, I'm breaking up here. I can't hear. No, I'll just be, it's too tough. I'll say the Hoyas, and there's no reason other than I I was born in '78, so UNLV's that's my team, right? So UNLV and the Fab Five, those are my high school year, my junior high school years, and so those are the teams I love as West Coast guys. And just I'm not rocking Georgetown shorts, right? Like I know the inseams are getting shorter and shorter. I'm not playing with a t-shirt underneath my jersey, like Pat Ewan and stuff. God. So as much as I would wear the Georgetown colors more than anything, I just think those last two teams are it for me. And yeah.
All right. It's all about the shorts for you.
Shorts and the shoes and whoever's honking their horn in the background. Yeah. Is that a train?
All right. That's a train outside my building. Right. Came at just the right time. But if I had to choose, I love all three of them, but I gotta go. I'm sorry. I gotta go with the Runnin Rebels, just because I love him to death. But Larry Johnson should have made that last shot. He had the chance to make the shot in the game against Duke in the semifinal, and he didn't. To me, that's a mistake. That compared to, Chris Webber calling the timeout, that's just an honest mental mistake that could happen in the course of a game. But Larry Johnson, he had ample opportunity to make the shot. He didn't. Gave it to Anderson Hunt. He threw it up, and the game was over. So I love all three, but I got to go with the Runnin Rebels.
Well, they were probably on the take too, which makes it even cooler, right? There's no way. I don't want to get in trouble, but there's no way they weren't on the take, right? And so
there's a picture of UNLV players in a hot tub with the guy. Richard, the Fixer Perry. That was his nickname, the Fixer. They're in the hot tub with him. Most notorious picture in college basketball history. So that's why it's not that far-fetched. Anything you want to imagine based on that picture doesn't seem that far-fetched to me.
That's the worst. That's the worst case of guilt by association, even more than Ed Martin. Just because Ed Martin was at least trying to do something good and trying to look out for those guys. But yeah, like that guilt by association. Worst case, and when you're in the hot tub and it's all over the media, it's just not a good look. But we love all three of them. All three of those teams have an incomparable legacy. Guys, I can't thank you enough for joining us and for having this amazing discussion. Dr. Lewis Moore, J.A. Adonde, Ben Osborne, thank you all so much for being on Game Recognized Game. And J.A., have safe travels to Paris.
Thank you. You got it. I'm out.
All right. Love you guys. All right. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, welcome. Thanks. Good to see you guys. Thanks for that story, man. It's funny. I hadn't thought of Tony Reed in so long, and as soon as you said it, man, his face just popped up in my head. I could see him standing in the middle of the newsroom there.
My pleasure. And I've got a great lead on the Buffs jackets for you, Professor Moore. I'll reply all to the email. My friend has got a license. You'll see.
Oh, okay. Because I like unlicensed stuff. So here's my Young T Rap Daryl Strawberry Eric Davis shirt.
That is so good.
So
wow.
That is so good. Shout out.